I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's speaker, a man whose name draws roughly 3.5 million results when you Google it. That's somewhere between Lady Gaga and Rupert Murdoch. Many of those search results credit Eric Schmidt for helping lead Google's phenomenal growth since he joined the company as CEO in 2001. Today, Google has a market cap of roughly $180 billion. Google searches number 3 billion a day. YouTube, which the company bought in 2006, is a video powerhouse that draws 100 million views a month. 2 years ago, Google went full bore into mobile, introducing a new operating system for cell phones. And its latest big project, according to widespread reports, involves a partnership with Intel, Sony, and Logitech to bring web technology and ultimately web advertising to our television sets. Author Ken Auletta, in his new book, Googled, The End of the World as We Know It, says Mr. Schmidt has been a good fit for Google. He had management experience as the chairman and CEO of Novell, and before that, he was Chief Technology Officer at Sun Microsystems. He has a degree in electrical engineering from Princeton and a master's and PhD in computer science from the University of California, Berkeley. Auletta says Mr. Schmidt should be recognized for helping broaden the company's products and particularly for investing aggressively and smartly in its international business. He says Mr. Schmidt has figured out how to employ disciplined decision-making without squelching the company's youthful exuberance and adding unnecessary rules. Google's most famous rule, of course, is don't be evil. Although inside the company, they treat it more like an unofficial slogan than a rule. Don't be evil is a principle that seems to guide many of the company's decisions, including its decision last month to stop censoring Google searches in China and redirect users to its site in Hong Kong. But not everyone sees the company as beneficent or even benign. As Google has grown, it has faced increasing scrutiny for antitrust and competitive issues here and abroad. Last year, the company dropped its plans for a proposed ad partnership with Yahoo after the Justice Department threatened to file suit to block the effort. Privacy rights advocates complain Mr. Schmidt is dismissive on the subject of government spying on search engines. They were particularly chagrined a few months ago when he told a television interviewer, if you have something that you don't want anyone to know, maybe you shouldn't be doing it in the first place. Others complain the company takes their work without paying them. That includes a group of artists who filed a federal lawsuit against the company last week. And as you know, it includes newspaper executives who have complained loudly that the company has stolen their content, made millions on their backs, and is forcing them to erect paywalls. Mr. Schmidt has said that newspapers shouldn't blame Google for their problems, and he suggested that the industry can dig itself out by becoming more innovative, by focusing on its customers, and taking a better advantage of the web. Tonight, he'll be talking about what he sees as the big trends that are shaping the internet and some of the lessons he's learned about how to navigate the constant pace of change that the web has engendered. Please join me in welcoming tonight's featured speaker, Eric Schmidt.
It's an honor to be here, and I'm very happy that you guys have come back to do your conference because what you do is incredibly important. I'm a reader. I love newspapers. I love the notion of actually reading them, and when you're finished with them, you feel like you're done. You sort of know what's going on. I love the notion of discovery that newspapers represent, that all of the things that I didn't know yesterday that I now know today because I finished the 3 papers that I read today already. On and on and on, the role of newspapers are fundamental, not just in America, but all around the world. We have goals in common. Google believes in the power of information. We believe that it's better to have more information than less. We also understand that information can annoy governments, it can annoy other people, but that ultimately the world is a better place with more information available to more and more people. And the flow of accurate information, diverse views, the debate that we're so used to, is really, really fundamental to a functioning democracy, as the previous speakers, I think, so eloquently said in their remarks and the examples and the things that they're doing. You all get criticized all the time. On the left, you get criticized for being too liberal. On the right, you get too conservative. You get it. In our case, we just get kicked out of China. It's the same thing, right? And I want to be clear here that we're not in the news business, and I'm not here to tell you how to run a newspaper. We're computer scientists, and trust me, if we were in charge of the news, it would be incredibly accurate, incredibly organized, and incredibly boring, right? There's an art to what you do, and if you're ever confused as to the value of newspaper editors, look at the blog world. That's all you need to see, right? So we understand how fundamental your mission and the things that you care about are. Now, the internet in many ways is certainly one of the most disruptive technologies in the course of history. It's certainly up there with, water systems and the electricity distribution systems of the world and that sort of thing. And it's disruptive in a particular way in our world because it has replaced the economics of scarcity with the economics of abundance. And all of us, I think, are dealing with some of the consequences of that. And any industry that's built on controlling information, literally preventing people from getting access for information for whatever business reason, is facing the issue of the broad and ubiquitous nature of how digital information goes. And we all understand all of these examples. And it's interesting now that users are speaking out with their time by moving online. All the evidence and all the examples that I could come up with in preparing for this speech indicate that there's more news being consumed online than there is in newspapers. And you are familiar with the statistics. 61% of the people get their news online, 50% get it on traditional local newspapers. And it's interesting that there's so much duplication now. One of the questions was how much is new reporting versus duplication? The estimate that I found indicated that about 80% of the stories have absolutely no content whatsoever. And of the 20% that have fresh content in it, half of those come from newspapers. So you want to understand how important newspapers are, you are basically the majority of the quality of the content and of the creative force. You understand that intuitively, it's also mathematically true. So in this sense, the web can ultimately be very good for news. If you think about it, you have more readers than ever. You have more sources than ever, for sure. You have more ways to report. And new forms of making money will develop. And they're underway now, and I want to give some examples of that. So we have a business model problem. We don't have a news problem. And that's ultimately, in my view, what all of us are trying to get to, because we're all in this together. Now, there's an Oscar Wilde quote, in America, the president reigns for 4 years, but journalism governs forever and ever. And I think it's important to understand how fundamental the fourth estate is to the functioning of our democracy. The other question I wanted to ask was, what's really new now? I mean, we've always had newspapers, we've always had scandals and political problems and, local news and this problem and that problem and celebrities and so forth and so on. There is, in fact, one thing that's quite new. What do our parents know now, what do our children know now that our parents did not know when they were the age of our children? They know about now. They know about precisely now in a way that our parents' generation did not. That this nowness drives everything. The sense of immediacy that is so fundamental, and by the way, for those of a certain age, seems overwhelming. But the fact of the matter is, it is this nowness that drives everything. And what happens is that you experience the reality of the moment in a way that's much, much more intense. And you see this when you look at young people who have so many diverse sources of information, all the digital devices and so forth and so on. And it's creating a problem which I'm going to call sort of the ersatz experience problem. That on the one hand, you have a sense of connectedness to everything, literally every event globally and so forth. You all live this, so you understand this very well. But you also have a false sense of the actual experience because you're not really there. So the trade-off is you know everything, but you're not physically in any one place. And that shift is actually a pretty profound one in the way society is going to consume media and news and so forth. And all of us are part of it. Google is obviously moving this very forward. So when you turn off your digital device, every single person here in this room has a mobile phone, some sort of portable computer, some sort of a device. If you turn it off right now, what am I taking away from you? That sense of connectedness. It's okay, you can turn them back on now. It's fine. I know it's tough, right? But just for a second there, you thought, oh my God, he's going to turn off my internet connection. When did that happen? When did the internet become so important that it was so fundamental? Well, I would argue that it occurred naturally, and that is a permanent change for all of us. So how do we manage this transition? Well, the obvious way is to think internet first. Because, in fact, if you were to design the businesses today, you would design them differently than the way they were designed 50 or 100 years from now. And it's important to understand that three things are coming together, and I'm going to give you some examples of this. That the powerful mobile devices that we all talk about, and new ones every day, and Google, of course, makes ours, and our competitors have others, are paired with the tremendous performance that we can now get on computers that are in the back end. Literally web servers, as you call them, but they're really supercomputers. And the combination of the client, literally the mobile device, and the powerful servers, and then the powerful network that people have spent the last 20 years developing, which you know is the internet, but is really a set of ways in which you get to this broad data network. It is the sum of that, and the capabilities and the technologies that will exploit the sum of that will define the next 10 or 20 years for all of us. And I have some examples, of course. So when I say internet first, I mean mobile first. What I've noticed in my profession is that now some of the most clever engineers are working on mobile applications ahead of personal computer applications. That people are literally moving to that because that's where the action is. That's where the growth is. That's where it's a completely unwashed landscape. We have no idea where folks are going to go. And it's interesting that mobile web adoption is growing. We looked at this, you look at historical patterns for internet adoption. The mobile web is being adopted 8 times faster than the equivalent point in the regular internet. So that would confirm my numbers. Half of all new internet connections are coming from mobile devices of one kind or another. 1 out of 3 people read news on their phones, literally. And if you think about it, so Google is busy making the Android phone. We have the Kindle, of course, and we have the iPad. Each of these form factors, the tablet, represents sort of, in many ways, your future, if I sort of hold them together. And you sit there and you say, well, I have a strong opinion about one or the other. Well, there's another person who likes the other, and another person who likes the other. So when you think about what is going to happen with newspapers, this is the future. And the way in which people build applications, the way people use these facilities are really, really quite subtle. If you look, the most recent one of these, of course, is the iPad. And the iPad, there are a number of very, very compelling iPad applications that were built by organizations represented here in the room, each of which represents a different experiment and how you'll consume news in a way that is targeted. So why are these devices different? I mean, why are they not just a more expensive version of a newspaper? After all, newsprint has been around for a long time. They're personal, and they're personal in a really, really fundamental way. They know who you are. So imagine that the next version of the newsreader will not only know who you are, but it'll know what you read, and it won't repeat itself. The newspaper that I get doesn't realize I read it yesterday or not. And it'll be more interactive, and it'll have more video, and it'll be more real-time because of this principle of now. And furthermore, it will integrate all of my sources together, the freedom to tweet, which is a wonderful headline, by the way. It will integrate them in a way that is only imagined a little bit today. So it is the union of that, the personalization, the media, and the ability to integrate that will drive so much together. Now, when you think about the stories, in our case, we've done a couple of things. We did something called Google Fast Flip, which is another way of, on the web, looking at pages very quickly. People love it. It's working very, very well. We work with a number of publications to do things which are generally known as living stories, where not only do you have the information, but you also have the links and the history and the structure, which again can be shown on any of these devices and many, many others. So when I go to a news site, I want that news site to know me, know about me, what I care about, and so forth. I don't want to be treated as a stranger, which is what happens today. So remember me, show me what I like, but also I want you to challenge me. I want you to say, here's something new, here's something you didn't know, here's an opposing view, Eric, in case you want to read it. We know from studies that about 2/3 of people will not choose that link, but we also know that 1/3 will. We want to get to that 1/3 as well as the 2/3 and give them a choice as well. One of the questions that you ask when you look at the internet today is, how do people consume news? How do they make decisions? And a lot of it is social. And the statistics about social consumption are really phenomenal. We talked a lot about Facebook and Twitter already, which is excellent. 1 out of every 6 minutes spent online is spent inside of a social network today. You wonder, why are these things so important if you don't use them yourself? The 2 girls who were trapped in a culvert in Australia, ages 11 and 13, who updated their Facebook status to say where they were and they were rescued, they understand the power of a social network. Or the gentleman who was terribly trapped in a Haitian shopping center and was not able to get out, who used his iPhone application to study how to bandage his arm until he was ultimately rescued. That's a person who understands the power of social networks. These are very, very real and very, very powerful. And the sum of mobile plus social means this union, if you will, has a lot of implications for how news will be consumed and so forth and so on. What's interesting, by the way, is that if you just take a simple example of tweets, the Twitter revolution and the Iranian revolution seem to go together. The retweeting of an initial tweet, roughly 20 times retweeted by a single person, can create a revolution. It's no different, by the way, than word of mouth. It's just faster because of that principle of the now, the principle that it all happens right now. It's interesting that this device has a 1 gigahertz processor on it. The iPad's similar. It's 1,000 Sun workstations. And I remember 20 years ago here coming to Washington, D.C. to do one of the first installations of that for $15 or $20 million of government and partner expenses. Today I have it in my hand, and it's very, very inexpensive. We obviously sell them, so I have a bias. But my point is, think about what has happened in that period of time. The same thing is true about the cloud. Remember I was talking about the servers? What's happening in the cloud is this enormous amount of information is getting in there, and we can use that cloud. How does, typical example, Google translates over 160 million web pages every day. Okay? No big deal, right? You said people use it all the time. Most of the web's in English, no big deal for us. Well, we launched on April 1st. Always the best day to launch a new product, by the way, April Fool's Day. A translation feature in our browser which automatically translates every page you go to. On the fly. So now all of a sudden, I mean, there are obviously examples. You can read the leading Hebrew newspaper next to the leading Arab newspaper in Cairo and compare the two. Furthermore, everyone else in the world can as well. All of a sudden, 1% of the web's content is in Arabic, but 5% of the population speaks Arabic. Right? There's another example where we can help balance and help people understand each other. If you think of it that way, then all of a sudden, every internet viewer in the world is your reader, including people who do not speak English. And that's a pretty profound accomplishment. What are some other things you can do with the cloud? Well, we have on our Android phone, and it's true of some of the other phones as well, you can take a picture of something, and we will use the parallelism of the net, and we'll go to a set of servers, and they'll vote as to what it is. Is it a menu? Is it the Eiffel Tower? Is it a picture of a person? Is it something we don't know? They vote and they figure out what it is most likely. Try it. It's called Google Goggles. It's another example. You can take a picture and have a large set of computers do something that it's just amazing. You can't do it. You just can't do it yourself anymore. Another example would be Google Voice. Most people do they do voice search by having a taxonomy essentially on the phone, where you speak and it does a little calculation and it says, oh, this is what he said. We don't do it that way. Instead, we take the strings of voice and we send it to 1,000 computers operating in parallel. They all think at the same time, and they send back. In parallel, they vote, and then they send back the answer. It works remarkably well. Another example of the power of the cloud. Now, the internet is about scale, and the same phenomena occurs. I was studying this because I was trying to figure out how big this thing is. Between the dawn of humanity and 2003, roughly 5 exabytes of information was created. An exabyte is roughly 1 million gigabytes, way to think about it. We generate that amount in every 2 days now. So you understand why it's so painful to get up in the morning? It's because in 1 day, at that rate, we have calculated or generated half of the entire human consumption of information that occurred in the entire history in half of that time. It's amazing. If you scale that, the current forecasts are on the order of 667 exabytes a year in 2013. So there is a data explosion, and the data explosion is overwhelming all of us. Of course, this is good business for people like Google and others who try to sort all this out. It's interesting that the internet pretty much connects every device to every other device on the planet now. There are on the order of 600 million servers, right? God knows how many devices in it, but it's in the many, many billions. So all of a sudden, you have as your source literally everything. So one way to think about the model is it's possible to instrument the entire world exactly the way it is. So you, if you're a political leader, you want to know something, well, everyone has a phone. You can ask their phones, with their permission, of course. You can actually measure things in real time that you couldn't before. Used to be you'd write some report, ask 3 people, make something up, and off you go. Now you can actually figure it out and figure out whether what people are saying is really what they're doing, which is always an interesting question, again, with their permission. So if you think of it in this context, you have this explosion of mobile devices, you have this connection and so forth. What does this do for the business world? Well, it's obvious that advertising, which is the business that Google is in, is going to do very well in this space. Because advertising works well when it's very targeted. Well, these devices are very targeted, okay? So we can give a personalized ad. Furthermore, Google and others are busy building what are called display ads that look an awful lot like the ads that are in traditional newspapers. And in fact, there's a lot of reasons to believe that the display ad business will start to grow fairly quickly with some new technology that we and others have been inventing. So you have a situation where not only will you have text ads, which is what got Google to where it is today, but you have the leaders in the display ads business. Google is a challenger today, but hopefully doing very well in that in the next few years, that you should be able to do very, very successful display advertising against this kind of content. You may not be able to do it against murders, right? Because it's very difficult to sort of get the right targeted ad in that case. We're going to advertise a knife, it's obviously terrible. And I'm not trying to make a joke about it, but it's a real business problem. But the sum of what you do, you clearly can do. It's the same as what we've seen before. But the other thing that's happening is you have the ability to get subscriptions. And we and others are working on ubiquitous ways in which subscriptions can be bundled, packaged, and just delivered. You can see this today with the 2 examples, the Kindle and the iPad, both of which have essentially a subscription model, which you can test. You can actually find out what will people pay for this. And eventually that model should have higher profitability because it has lower cost of goods, right? Because you don't have the newspaper, the printing costs, the distribution costs. So there's every reason to believe that eventually we'll solve this and ultimately bring some significant money into this thing. What I like, though, is that those are 2 specific examples of really thinking much bigger. What could you do? Go back to the cloud. What could you do that's really interesting? I found some examples. The St. Petersburg Times won a Pulitzer Prize for a website that they built to fact-check the 2008 presidential campaigns. First time a website's ever won a Pulitzer Prize. Pretty phenomenal. It's an example of the kind of scale that they could do. There are over 20 organizations that are pooling primary source materials into something called Document Cloud. Many people here in the room are using this. And again, people are helping each other using the collaborative tools of the web to do their job better. Right? This is wonderful. It's another example of using the cloud and using the power of social networks. So I would tell you that the right thing to do is to figure out not to do things statically, but rather to continue these experiments and do them with even greater industriousness. A Ralph Waldo Emerson quote is that don't be too timid and squeamish about your actions. All life is an experiment. On the internet, there is never a single solution. Everyone wants a simple answer. It's like, you watch television and cable, there's always a simple answer to every question. Right? We all understand why that isn't true. Life is, in fact, a series of complex judgment decisions, shades of gray, if you will, based on your point of reference, your belief system, the things you care about in the legal system. The fact of the matter is, there are not simple answers to any of these questions, and in order to really find them, you're going to have to run some experiments. You can do lots and lots of different things. I would tell you that the attitude should be similar to what we've been able to do, to prototype early and often, to gather and analyze data, and then iterate, right? Because you can instrument everything. If you don't have readers in one area, we can figure out why, because we can actually watch and see they went to this site and they didn't go to that site. It's possible now to figure these things out in a way that you could never before. So with that as an attitude, you can actually try to figure out what people really care about and figure out a way to get the product to be better in what they really want. And this, to me, allows new forms of storytelling to emerge, which is, I think, ultimately what we're all about. We're all about a narrative of ideas, a narrative of excitement, a narrative of fun. And there are lots and lots of examples of this, which I won't go through. So when you think about it, think of it as an experimentation, not just at the product sense, but also at sort of the consumption sense. Because ultimately it's about the reader. And the good news is you have lots of readers. And they're spending more and more time looking at your content. We know this because your markets are global now, because we can translate it into every language, and we can reach almost everybody. Now, why is this so hard? All right, why has this been so difficult for all of us? And I say it together. I think it's because the well-defined borders that defined everyone's career paths, including mine, by the way, are essentially gone because of the invention of the internet. The sort of pre-internet world had its structure. There was this room and this so forth and so on. Everyone is now your reader, as we've discussed. You can reach anyone, anytime, anywhere, on any device. But everyone is also your competitor. And that's where the hard part comes. The barriers to entry, as we all understand, are basically zero. And there's an awful lot of low-quality stuff that's happening as a result. We have to solve that problem over time. But also, everybody's your partner, because you can collaborate in a way that you could never before. Figuring out when to compete, when to collaborate, when to go solo, when to work in a group, strikes me as one of the sort of key questions for all of you to think about. I don't know the answer, by the way, but I know that you'll have a combination answer to make it right. I am convinced that high-quality journalism will triumph, because I am convinced that it is essential to the functioning of modern democracies. And I also believe that the only proper way to run a country is some form of modern democracy. We see lots of examples of why that's true. We need you guys to triumph. We need what you do to count and to be a larger share, not a smaller share of the voice. To me, technology, and I'll finish up by saying, technology allows you all to talk directly to your users in a way you couldn't before. They're busy relaxing, they're busy consuming, they're busy learning, they're busy having fun. It's the new now. They want to know it right now. And you have an opportunity to go and really drive that and make that happen. So thank you very much.
Mr. Schmidt has agreed to take questions. As our usual practice, we like to reserve the questions for ASNE members. Please identify yourself and your organization.
I'm happy to take any questions. Yes, sir.
There was this Ricardo Pimentel, Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. There was a Supreme Court ruling this last week, Comcast versus FCC, and there's a phrase bandied about, net neutrality. Can you tell us what that phrase means to you and what it should mean to us?
Thank you. First place, the phrase net neutrality is being used by lots of different people to mean different things. So I appreciate the way you asked the question. We have said, and indeed I and our friends at Verizon, particularly Ivan, have written some joint op-eds on precise this issue to try to define it. We have a problem on the internet that it's possible to overwhelm the internet by one or two actors, and so there's a legitimate need to, if you will, manage the data type. In other words, we don't want to have video overwhelming everything else, which is the typical way this is expressed. What we are concerned about is that the people who run the internet might use that excuse as an opportunity to then promote, for example, one video over another. And this would roughly be the same argument that if you owned a media company, you would only allow that media company to be available over your television stations, right? Just as a bad model. You know, imagine if Sony, and they don't do this, if their Sony televisions could only receive one kind of programming, it would be bad for everybody. So we think it's important that whatever regulations ultimately get put in place, and I'm sure there will be some, guarantee that within the same class of service the operators do not favor. We are okay if they want to discriminate against one category against another. So video, if they want to say video needs to be prioritized lower than voice, for example. But within video, as a typical example, we don't want them to censor one by charging for one and not the other, that kind of thing. And that's what we've been arguing for a long time. I think our view is with the, everything we've been able to figure out is our view is pretty much where the American people are. People want choices. They understand that there are some issues around capacity and so forth, and so they want some thoughtful way of doing that. On the specific, I'm not a lawyer. I don't understand the specific reasoning behind the decision, but I'm sure that that ultimately the internet will have some kind of rule like I'm describing, either enforced on it or done by agreement among the key players. It's just too fundamental. You can't have the operators picking the voices. It's just a bad decision. Yes, sir.
Good evening. I'm Andy Glass. I'm an editor at Politico here.
Hi.
There's a lot of concern in our business and in the public at large that the government is broken. It's not functioning well. And a piece of that is the role of money in politics. So my question is, with regard to the internet, and particularly social networks, which you cited, do you see the possibility that social networks will leach out to some extent the role of money in politics and empower people to participate in politics in a way that does not require the huge sums that television consumes and, frankly, newspaper ads as well?
It's obviously a very good and important question. We have some data that would the first question I always ask is, what's different now from 50 years ago? Because the government was broken 50 years ago and 100 years ago too. Our democracy is designed to be kind of broken. I don't know if you sort of study it. The whole notion is that the states have all the power, the Congress is deliberative, the presidency is limited. You know, there are all sorts of reasons why it was designed that way 200 years ago. We always forget that it was designed to actually have this property. I think if you look at the Obama campaign as opposed to the Obama presidency, you see a very good example of how the social world can be used to affect political change. And roughly it went like this. And I was a supporter of Obama as a matter of disclosure. I think people know that. Before, when he was a challenger to Secretary Clinton, now Secretary Clinton, he had no money. He used the internet to raise his profile and did so very cleverly and got himself organized. Once he was a significant campaigner, he had to have a field operation. So he built that too, and he knew how to do that from his previous experience and did that again very, very well. What was interesting was that that was not sufficient, that eventually in the latter part of the campaign, he also, in order to win the presidency, spent hundreds of millions of dollars on traditional advertising. So the answer to your question is that the social media and the internet are probably, they're very helpful with people who are poorly funded, but money really does matter. And although it does give an opposing view, if you will, a platform, it does give them a way of being heard, that ultimately the power of money in politics is going to remain very, very important. So I would argue that the social media, that the internet really did make a difference because it ultimately created a choice, but ultimately it was the traditional mechanism that delivered it. And I think that's a rough reading of it. A couple more, yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
First of all, I'm Ken Paulson, and I want to congratulate you on the stand you've taken in China. I am curious, though, because everything you read is that every other corporation is willing to look the other way. And is this a matter of you'll be the only one out there standing on principle, or that it's only a matter of time before China overplays its hand with other corporations? Are you a little surprised you have not had more support from others on this?
It has gone as we expected. Google is an unusual company, as I think has been well written by your reporters. And we have the sort of the principles of the company were set out pretty early when we went public. We have the ability to make decisions without a lot of short-term financial focus if we decide to do that. So all of the usual reasons why you would be concerned about not operating in China are not so important for us. We were able to make a decision based on principle. And I would expect that most other companies either don't agree with our principles, or more likely they agree with our principles, but mechanically they can't do it. Right? And so I suspect that you won't see a lot of others, but there's always a possibility. Yes, sir.
Bill Sternberg with USA Today. Let me follow up on Ken's question. How long do you think the so-called Great Firewall of China can last, and who ultimately wins, the army of censors or an army of smart internet users trying to get around those censors?
I like the way you phrased it, because it is a battle. And in China, the battles are large. There's lots of people on both sides. We know that there is a reasonably large group of people within China who are seeking non-censored information. We also know that the Great Firewall, as you call it, not only exists, but there's an awful lot of ways in which the various people who run it are trying to make it stronger. I think it's too early to say. I don't think we know yet. And I think that if I were to make my own prediction, I would be accused of having my own global bias. I've learned from my Chinese friends that they have their own biases on this. And I would encourage you all to view this not so much through a First Amendment issue, but rather in a how does a society wish to grow, and how will the Chinese citizens ultimately decide how they want to run their country. Because ultimately the Chinese citizen will win. It's important to know that there's a lot of evidence of public support for some of their policies, which would not be true in the United States. So that's, again, where you can't give a simple, hey, it's obvious kind of an answer. Go ahead, yes, sir.
Thomas Mitchell, Las Vegas Review-Journal. I was curious on one thing you indicated. You said there's a way now that you can give someone who is an opposite point of view. I've been concerned for a long time about the polarization of the country, sure, because, like the Amazon concept, you like this book, here's 5 other books just like it. You think that there's a way then to can you develop on that concept a little bit, please?
Yeah, the simplest answer is that there's something called in computer science, there's something called collaborative filtering. And roughly what happens is that we want to give you a set of choices. And so we look at who your friends or people who are like you are, and we look at what they're doing, not you. We rank what they're doing, we sum all of the things that they're doing together, and we show you the things that are most likely. So the Amazon book recommendation, which is a fun service, by the way, is a classic example. People like you. Well, it turns out that mathematically you can also do the inverse of what I just described. So people who are very much not like you, like this. Because mathematically it's just the other set. And so it's easy to do. And it will be harder to surface the really cogent arguments, the ones that change your view, because it's hard, as you know, with editors, it's always hard to see that incredibly crisp argument that really changes people's minds. But that would be our goal. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Sharon Chan. What do you say to publishers like Rupert Murdoch who feel that companies like Google should be paying the producers of the content for the content?
I think it's best to look at Rupert's comments as in the context of a business negotiation, because he's a very good businessman. A couple of things to know. All the people who complain about that have the option of putting a file called a robots.txt file in their website, which will absolutely prevent Google from getting access to that information. And it's absolutely their right, it's absolutely their content. We don't want it if they don't want us to have it, that kind of thing. We're not trying to take it without it. So in most cases, people have decided to give us that information. And even people who are operating behind paywalls have decided to give us some of the information because we send a lot of traffic to their sites. So on the one hand, we're evil because, according to these people, because we are sort of causing the monetization to go away. On the other hand, we send enormous amounts of traffic to their websites. People come to Google first. We send them right to there. We don't try to keep them. And so my view is that what we want to do is we want to monetize those users. In other words, if we're going to send a lot of people to the sites that are represented here in the room, we want you to have tools and technologies which will allow you to make a lot of money from those users. Because ultimately, we need more money going into the system. Sitting here and dividing up the money where the subscription revenues are going down, the circulations are going down, it's a bad business. Much, much better to get people so excited about this new form of content that they're willing to shell out, a significant amount of money. And that's probably, given that Rupert's context, we're in the context of a business negotiation, that's probably all I should say. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yes, my name's Robert Levine, and about a month ago, the motions came out in the YouTube suit against Viacom.
Yes.
And in Viacom's motion, what you see is emails and instant messages that look at a pattern of YouTube doing the least it possibly could under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act to get copyrighted content off the site. In Google's motion, which it tried not to release, it says that, how can we know what Viacom owned? Viacom put some stuff up there. That's obviously not true of a lot of other organizations, such as the Premier League, and most notably for this audience, Robert Torr, an independent Los Angeles journalist. When YouTube executives were asked about their memories of stuff, they did not find their emails, and Larry Page did not remember, according to the motion, whether he had favored buying YouTube. How does that square with Google's motto of "Don't be evil"?
Wow. Well, first place, you're asking me about something which is actively being litigated. So I want to be careful to give you an answer that's not a direct response to the legal challenges that you made. Our response to what you just said is in the filing that we gave, which sounds like you've actually read, doesn't sound like you believe it. And as you understand, these lawyers basically argue against each other with large billing fees to both firms. So part of the strategy here is to let that go on for a while, I guess. But the fundamental principle that we're trying to establish, let me answer your question without so specifically on YouTube, because I really don't want to answer something which is so actively being litigated. What is the role of copyright? What is the role of fair use? Sometimes I feel like we have lawyers, and I can't figure out, there's the one school that teaches people fair use, and the other school forgot to teach them that, right? And there are disagreements at a very fundamental level of what we think is a very fundamental principle. In the case of user-generated content, the problem that we have is understanding who the real owner is. Now, you cited a couple of examples of specific people that you know to be legitimate and real, and I'm sure that's correct. Our computers don't know that, and furthermore, they don't know that you're real. Now, I know that you're real, but our computers don't, because you could be a computer impersonating yourself, and you could be lying to us. There's all sorts of reasons why we don't really know. So for many, many reasons, we need the copyright holder to validate that the copyright is real. And one of the issues in the Viacom case is whether that principle occurs earlier. By your question, your bias, if I could say in your question, you may not understand that all user-generated content, if Google loses the Viacom case, it puts in question all of the user-generated content, which is the majority of the content today. Because if humans have to validate who the owner of a content is before it goes up, it will change the entire way in which the internet works. Furthermore, if those humans work for me, how will I know how to tell them who the copyright holder is or not? And these are the challenges. Let me just finish. As to your question about Larry Page, I don't know what his testimony was, and I did not read it, but I can tell you that at Google, we work collectively, so I want to give you a precise answer. At the end of the day, we all agree. Okay. Did you want to answer a clarifying question? That's fine. Go ahead.
Having humans vet different things, which I obviously understand. I'm just curious, isn't that what Google Video did for a while before you had purchased YouTube?
Again, a very precise legal question, and the answer is no. Do we have other questions? Sounds like we're pretty much, we've run over time anyway. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.